I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
Like Jeremy said in his prayer, last week we looked at 3 stories in Daniel that I would venture to guess that most people know. People that don't even believe in God know those stories. But they miss the lessons to be learned, don't they? Lessons of choice. Remember, Daniel chose to refuse the luxurious living offered him by the kingdom in order to follow Jewish custom and God's law. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego chose to worship Jehovah only and refuse the king's orders to bow down to his golden idol. And for that they were thrown into a raging furnace. And Daniel, being betrayed by his colleagues, was thrown into the lion's den because he chose to continue, as always, to pray to Jehovah, the God of all the earth. And all that we would follow these examples and learn from them. So this week we begin with this map here of the New Babylonian Empire under Cyrus. And I wanted us just to again consider something here. Daniel came to Babylon in his youth. And he grew up in the most powerful state in the world at that time. Reading secular history on Babylon, it's hard to even imagine the looks of the place. He watched Nebuchadnezzar, and history tells us that for 45 years, Nebuchadnezzar never wearied of building and reconstructing that city. And it was about 2,100 acres, they say. And he changed it into, with lavish palaces, with buildings. It said that commerce and work and trade were at booming levels in that area. And in the midst of all this, that young exile named Daniel was made second in command. And so we stop and think about that. Daniel shows us that it's possible with a deep conviction for the Lord to hold an official position within a nation. And like Daniel, continue to hold that powerful position if it would be God's will. So it's just, good to remind ourselves that these biblical characters are simply the same as we are. But we see their love and their desire to... is this on?
Should be.
Oh, there we go. So the last section in our purpose of Daniel is Jesus Christ. Daniel chapter 9 is where our next question comes from. And in the beginning of this chapter, it's good to remind ourselves of the context here. In the beginning, we see that Daniel is reading from a collection of writings of Jeremiah. Back in Jeremiah 25, verses 8 to 14, I won't read that, but Jeremiah in there is prophesying about the captivity, Jerusalem, the desolation. And Daniel learned from Jeremiah that the completion of the desolation of Jerusalem was 70 years. And desolation just simply means that the land is laying in waste, and also including the captivity. And through his reading and some yearly calculations, Daniel gathered that the captivity was nearing its end. And not doubting God's faithfulness to keep his promises of restoration, Daniel is moved to pray in earnestness to God for a speedy completion. And his prayer is a frank confession that the Hebrew people, and also he includes himself, which I thought was amazing. And he said in that prayer that they all deserved all the calamities which had come upon them. And with earnest intercession, he asked God to hear his prayer and remove the judgments from the people and extend his mercies towards them. And also to rebuild Jerusalem and the restoration of the temple. And it seems in that reading that even before Daniel's prayer is finished, God has already dispatched an angel, the angel Gabriel, to impart skill and understanding to Daniel. And Daniel prays to know when the 70 years of captivity were to end. But we see through that the news that Gabriel brings to Daniel is not a direct answer to his prayer, but instead the answer tells him there is a 70-week period determined or cut out for redemption from another sort of captivity, which will begin with the restoration of Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the temple, and it will end with the death of one called Messiah, the Prince. And we'll try and not get too confused with the 70-week period. If you turn back to Leviticus chapter 25, the term here, this 70-week period, remember the Jews had Sabbath years, if you remember that? And verse 8 of Leviticus 25 helps us to determine what this 70-week period means. In chapter 25 of Leviticus, verse 8, and you shall count, Moses says, and you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself. 7 times 7 years. And the time of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be to you 49 years. So we see here how this terminology, their years were divided into weeks of years. It's hard maybe for us to understand that because we don't calculate time in that matter. And as in this important prophecy, each week containing 70 years, and the 70 weeks here then amount to 70 times 7, or 490 years. I think the math is correct there. But that is simply how they would understand that. And this chapter, like a lot with Jeremy's study in Revelations, man runs wild with this chapter. And if we remember the context, it's not all that confusing. But Jeremy?
Especially if you remember, he's talking about the Messiah. It's not, the Messiah hadn't come yet. Many people want to take this chapter and say, well, this applies to Jesus' second coming. He hadn't come yet. And so when Messiah comes, that's talking about Messiah's first coming, not the second.
Exactly. And we're going to look at that question now. And this study, like Revelations, it's so hard to not try and get into this too deep. But, we do our best with an overview. But if we get into it, well, then we get into it. Then we all have answers to give people when they challenge us. But our question here is, in what ways does Daniel's prophecy of the Messiah correspond to the story of Jesus presented in the New Testament? We'll read verses 24 to 27, 2 verses each. Jeremy, I'll start with you and then we'll go over to 10.
70 weeks are determined for your people and for your holy city, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sins, to make reconciliation for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy. Know therefore and understand that from the going forth of the command to restore and build Jerusalem unto Messiah the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. The street shall be built again, and the wall, even in troublesome times.
And after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate.
Okay, thank you. These 4 verses, if you dare get looking at commentaries on these 4 verses, I'd suggest don't. Just read these verses, and in answering Dave's question here, we will see how this fits into place with Jesus. But the word Messiah, I just saw, the word Messiah occurs only 4 times in Scriptures. In this passage, and in John 1 and verse 44, and John 4 and 25. And it's synonymous with the meaning, with the word Christ the Anointed. That's all it is. The Jews spoke the Hebrew word Messiah, and the New Testament Christians spoke the Greek word for Christ. And for Daniel, the vision was pointing forward in time to one that would be anointed by God. And Daniel in this prophecy introduces the most important time prophecy in the Bible. And the reason for saying that is it concerns, remember Daniel was praying to find out about the end of captivity. But this prophecy that Daniel was given concerns the last act in God's provision for the salvation of mankind. And the provision was to be accomplished through the instrumentality of Daniel's people, the Jewish people. And Gabriel said that, and while their dispensation was still in force. And I did look at John 1, and if you just look at John 1 and 41, having understood here what Daniel is prophesying about, and the Jewish people are looking ahead. Carla, do you want to read verse 41 in John 1?
He found first his own brother Simon, and said to him, "We have found a Messiah," which translated means Christ.
Okay, what do we see here? What can we understand about the prophecy of Messiah here? What's this show?
The Jews understood it. Andrew was going to Peter, we found him. We found him, and in order to know that in order to know you found something, you first have to know what you're looking for.
Right.
And so, I don't know if that's the answer you were going for, but that's the answer I see.
Exactly. That's what I'm looking for. We're not looking for something down the road. The Jewish people knew, Andrew knew, Philip knew that the one who Moses and the prophets had spoke of was in his presence. And it's quite amazing also that if you look at verse 4, maybe it was chapter 4, the Samaritan woman is what I'm after.
Yeah, it's chapter 4.
Is it 4?
Yeah.
Well, and I wrote down the chapter and not the verse. But it's amazing, even the Jewish people, Philip knew what he was looking for.
25.
25?
4 and 25.
Okay, Gord, do you want to read verse 25, chapter 4? Please.
The woman said to him, I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things.
Okay, thank you. But can I write that down? I'll do it
There's
later.
one on the left side.
This is kind of amazing, isn't it? Because the Samaritans only knew the first 5 books of Moses' law. They knew those 5 books. And she was awaiting the Messiah. But Jesus assures her that he is the one. Remember, she was waiting for the Messiah, but she wasn't sure about Jesus. So we see that, Daniel's prophecy didn't go unheeded. People, the Jewish people had been looking for centuries, awaiting who this Messiah was, and now, like Philip said, they knew. And Gabriel also says to finish, or to literally shut up the transgression. Okay? And we know that the exile in Babylon was a punishment, wasn't it, to the Israel people. But it wasn't a full atonement, was it, for the people. And that, Daniel is saying, is going to come after the 70-week period, through the entrance of one called the Messiah. And John 1 and verse 29, what's that say? What does that say about the Messiah? Lisa, did you want to read that, please?
Next day, John saw Jesus coming towards him and said, Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away sin.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Lisa. Who's John introducing us to here?
Jesus.
The Messiah, right? The Messiah, the Prince. And Jesus took care of this full atonement for the people by dying on the cross. Christ made reconciliation or atonement for iniquity by offering himself once for all. In Hebrews 7 and verses 26 to 28 make that claim. Verses 26 and 28 I'll just read for those listening, because we don't leave any questions unanswered. But verse 26 explains, for such a high priest was fitting for us, who is holy, harmless, undefiled, separate from sinners, and has become higher than the heavens. It does not need daily, as those high priests, to offer up sacrifices, first for his own sins and then for the people. And for this he did once for all, when he offered up himself. For the law appoints as high priests men who have weaknesses, but the word of the oath, which came after the law, appoints the Son, who has been perfected forever. And Gabriel went on to say after that, to bring in righteousness. Okay? Who else could be the author of that act? Only Christ, right? And who else could have offered the opportunity for us to become righteous other than Christ? The old law and the moving ahead every year of man's sins was nailed to the cross, or righteousness will continue, for righteousness to continue forever if we remain faithful. To me, it's pretty hard to not see by all those verses exactly who Daniel was speaking of and who we read of in the New Testament. I don't know if anyone has any other thoughts on that. But it seems to fit.
So you're going to go into the more of Daniel 9 later, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, a little bit. Well, no, you go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, Jesus refers to this prophecy in Matthew 24. And so we don't have to wonder what Daniel 9 is talking about, when people want to come along and say, this is the second coming of Christ. They
Right.
usually try to tie it with Matthew chapter 24 and say, that's the second coming of Christ. But it's not. It was the destruction of Jerusalem. And that was the desolation that was talked about. 62 weeks Messiah will be cut off, but there were 70 weeks. And so, because Jesus says this was that which is spoken by Daniel the prophet. And so we don't have to wonder if Daniel 9 refers to the second coming, because it does not.
Exactly.
It refers to the destruction of Jerusalem, which was the question that was asked at the beginning of that chapter.
Right, exactly. I think we get into those thoughts later, but I was trying, like with Revelations, we're trying to do an overview, but then I got to thinking, well, you know, premillennialism is drawn out of this book. And so if we don't understand, or we need to understand how to explain to other people when they confront us with those thoughts. But we're asked here now, has Daniel's vision of the Son of Man been fulfilled? And if so, when was it fulfilled? Let's go back to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14. I think, Tim, do you want to start and I'll work our way back?
I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one night the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. The dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed.
Okay. To begin, my thought for this question was, I had thought to help us understand our reading, maybe we first need to determine who is or what is the Ancient of Days. And we read of that phrase first in verse 9. Daniel, in this vision, he says, I watched till thrones were put in place, and the Ancient of Days was seated. So what's that tell us? Is the Ancient of Days speaking of time, or is it speaking of someone?
Person.
The which one?
Person.
Right.
A being.
Yeah, because it's seated.
Something that can sense.
Yeah, the Ancient of Days is seated. And then, how does it describe who is seated here? It says, his garment was white as snow, and the hair of his head was like pure wool. His throne was a fiery flame, its wheels a burning fire. Now, who do we think of there, maybe?
Christ.
Jesus Christ.
Well, okay, God, that's kind of what I was thinking. But that's, if you read and continue on, as Daniel looks into his vision, and he does not see the everlasting God, but God is represented as an old man. And now God is not called an old God, but the appearance of age just inspires to us the highest degree of respect, and it conveys the impression of majesty. And it is elevated by the robe, white as snow, and the hair of his head is like pure wool. And both symbols are spotless, purity, meaning purity and holiness. And what Kala just said, remember our Revelation study? Revelations 1 and 14. What do we read there? Sandy, do you want to read that? Revelations 1, if you have it. Sorry, I took us from the front of the Bible to the back. So don't panic. Yeah, verse 14 would be enough.
His hair and hair were white like as white as snow, and his eyes like a flame of fire.
Okay, that was speaking of Christ, but, and Jeremy can help me here if he has any thoughts, but the one here now in our reading, one like the Son of Man, is presented before the Ancient of Days. So one like the Son of Man is being presented to one before the Ancient of Days, which I believe is the Father. Okay? And now the Son of Man is used, who would we think of? Where did we first hear that phrase in our Old Testament studies? Jeremy did the book. Can you think? Ezekiel, okay? But that phrase is used extensively in Ezekiel, but as applicable to him, wasn't it? Every time we read of Son of Man in Ezekiel, it was God was speaking to Ezekiel. And it's used as a continued admonition to that prophet, to Ezekiel, to remind him that he is a man like all the rest. But now the phrase of Son of Man is often found in the New Testament, isn't it? And it's a favorite term used by who? Who used that term in the New Testament?
Jesus.
Right, Jesus. Right, speaking of himself, didn't he? And nowhere else in the Old Testament is it used in connection with Christ, but in here. I hope that might have helped, not confused you, but Jeremy?
Well, the problem that people have with this question, the one that Dave's asked, is because not only is it one like the Son of Man, who everyone will admit has got to be Jesus. It's his next phrase, coming in the clouds.
Right.
Because you find that in Matthew 24:30, Matthew 26:64, Matthew 13:26, Mark 13:26, all the way throughout the New Testament. And you say, and they take this context and apply it to every one of those contexts when they're not talking about the same thing. Coming in the clouds is sometimes can refer to judgment, as far as when you see, it's the same as the sun being turned into, sun darkened, the moon turned into blood.
Right.
Represents God's judgment. It doesn't always represent the same judgment, though. But coming in the clouds, when they want to combine it with Matthew 24 and say, now you'll see the Son of Man coming in the clouds, that's connected with this prophecy, yes, but that's the destruction of Jerusalem. And Christ, it can be used symbolically, and it can be used literally. And the context is going to determine what it is, because it's even used in Revelation about the Son of Man coming in the clouds.
Yeah.
And it's not referring to the same event, even though it's the same imagery that's used.
Right, exactly. All those verses I had written down, and you hit the nail on the head. In Revelations 1 and 7, in our Revelation study, we probably forgot it because it was in the very first chapter, but verse 7 says, "Behold, he is coming with clouds, and every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn because of him." And all those verses that Jeremy gave, I thought of Acts 1 and verse 9, where we hear again that phrase of coming in the clouds. His disciples, and now after Jesus had spoke to them, while they were watching, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And given to Christ also to help back up Daniel's prophecy here, and has this been fulfilled, given to Christ by the Father was dominion, meaning rule or authority. He was set over a kingdom, over his kingdom. And, you can compare Matthew 28 and 18, John 3 and 35. I didn't know if it was necessary to read them. And 1 Corinthians 15 and 27, and Isaiah 9 and verse 6. Even before all this has been fulfilled, again along with Daniel, Isaiah prophesied. And all people and nations might serve him. Daniel's prophecy leads to that thought. And just quickly compare Acts 9 and verse 34 to 35 with that. Right. Well, that all nations might serve Jesus. I had in Acts 9.
What was your verse in Acts 9? What's the verse number you said? Acts 9 what?
34 and 35.
I think that's Acts 4. No.
So I marked down the wrong one again.
Yeah.
So I'll try Ephesians 2. They all these verses give us that thought. Ephesians 2, 13 and 14. But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, who has made both one and has broken down the middle wall of separation. All these verses show us, it's undeniable, prove that Christ now rules. He's not ruling in the millennium, as men twist all these scriptures. All these verses tell him that he is ruling now in title and exercise. And when he comes the second time, that rule will be seen visibly in the power of his appearance. We'll see that and understand that. Jeremy?
Well, I like that phrase at the end of verse 14. His kingdom, the one which shall not be destroyed, that connects this vision with the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had about the kingdom that was carved out of the rock. And it's the same language used. This kingdom will not be destroyed. And so when you connect those two prophecies that are in the same book, talking about this kingdom, that was in the days of the fourth kingdom. The Romans, we had the hand that carved out of the rock and destroyed all those other kingdoms, but it won't be destroyed. It's the same kingdom as Christ.
Right, exactly. It just helps, and those listening, all these prophecies can be understood fully and easily if we use Scripture properly. But as we know, man tries to prove some man-made theory, and he only uses a little section out of a book in the Bible, as we saw in Revelations, and we see tons of that in Daniel. But it doesn't fit the whole picture, the whole puzzle, if you will, of what God intended. And because of Daniel's, I believe, faithfulness, because God calls him his beloved through this book, and Daniel's prayer, you have time, read Daniel's prayer. It's just amazing, his character. And God granted him these visions, not only for himself, but also for our assurance with Christ, as far as Christ goes. So we'll move on. If anyone else had any thoughts along that. We move now into the content of Daniel, and we look at the life and work of Daniel. Daniel's chapters 1 to 6 contains a great amount of biographical information about Daniel's life. His career spanned almost 70 years. And he was at the right hand. It's amazing. He was at the right hand of 3 kings and then 1 empire ruler, Belshazzar. And King Nebuchadnezzar was the first king, King Belshazzar was the second, and then King Cyrus, who took the kingdom from Belshazzar, and Darius, who ruled by order of Cyrus. Remember, Cyrus set Darius over the empire as second in command because he was too busy doing other things. And when Cyrus did this, when he completed his campaign, and it seems that he turned the political affairs over to his uncle Darius. And Darius appointed 120 princes. That was one of his first acts, and those men managed all the business matters. And of those 3 presidents that Darius chose, Daniel was, in my words, the CEO. He was the top man. And Dave wrote in our lesson book, just made that point, that Darius was second in command of the kingdom, and he appointed Daniel third, which is pretty amazing, for that kind of reasoning. And the reason for that is given in Scripture, isn't it? Why Daniel was appointed. Because he had superior talents and that there was an excellent spirit in him. And so much so that Darius wanted to make him ruling authority over the whole realm, didn't he? Including those other presidents and princes. And thus our story begins, and we spoke of it last week a little bit, but how did Daniel's jealous colleagues attempt to destroy him? And what does their approach say about Daniel's character? In Daniel 6, we might probably, the bell hasn't gone yet, but maybe we'll, if we read those 11 verses, I think the bell will probably be going, and then we can think about this. There you go. So we have time, we'll just read chapter 6, verses 1 to 11, and I'll begin Annie, do you want to read 2 verses, and then we'll continue back to Henry? Daniel chapter 6, and we'll just refresh our minds of this story.
It pleased the Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, sufficient throughout the kingdom, and over the 3 presidents, including many of those satraps will overcome, so that the king had suffer no loss.
Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and the satraps, and because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and the satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they couldn't find no charge of fraud, because he was faithful, nor was there any error or fraud from the king.
Then the men said, we shall not have any wrongful acting against this Daniel, unless we find it in connection with the law of this God. Then those princes and satraps came by the agreement with the king and said to him, O king, there is a big living forever.
governors of keeping the administrators and centrals, the councilors and the advisors, and have a concern together to establish a royal statute and to make a formal decree that whoever petitions and guard a man for 30 days, except you, O king, should be cast into the den of the man. Now, O king, establish the decree and sign the writing, so that it cannot be charged according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter.
Therefore King Darius signed the written decree. Now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home, and in his upper room with windows open towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times that day, and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days.
Then these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God.
Okay, thank you. So let's read that over again at home, and we'll begin next week by answering this question.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord, nor to